Everybody.
Hello.
Hello. Now, my God, you've got enough shelf space. Now, that's what I need.
Yeah, so do I. I just thought it looks like a nice picture, so I took it. Given my alma mater put it out, so I did actually get to study in that library once upon a time, but it's definitely not my library. I like to tell everybody, give me 5 or 10 years, and maybe I'll have a library like that.
How are the silence? How's the evening in New York, Gareth?
Oh, New York.
Good, beautiful weather today. Like, it was cool in the morning and, reasonably nice in the day. And I didn't get to spend much time outside because I was working all day, but the little time I spent outside in the midday and afternoon was really nice.
Good. Yes, we're having good weather out here too. So,
where are you, Neville?
I'm in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I'm in Novato, California. So we're far flung, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yes.
Very global group here. I like to wait until 5 after to give people a little bit of grace period before we get started. So we'll wait another few more minutes. And then, Neville, if you don't mind, I'll give a quick intro to the Freethinker Institute, which I'll put the slide up just to have it up. And then, and then we'll go into the talk. Neville, do you have an idea of how long you'll be going?
Well, you mentioned, I think, you said something like 2 hours. Is that what's right?
Yeah, that's normally how it goes. I just wanted to check.
Yeah. We'll just tailor it to go as far as we can, and it doesn't matter that we get, So we're looking at around 50 terms of community education, how we read community education, but it doesn't matter I'll at the start I will just sort of flick over those things, those 50, just to give people an idea of the scope. But we don't have to walk through all of them.
Okay. I'm just very tired, so that's the only reason I'm asking. Is it's been a long day for me, but I'll try to hang out for the 2 hours if I can. So, but I'll probably want to peace out around 9 o'clock. So.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So yes, I make it 9:04 here.
Yeah. So I'll give it one more minute, and then I'll do a quick intro.
Okay.
Put my alarm on. There we go. So I was expecting a few more people. And we got like 25 RSVPs, and we usually get a 50% show rate, but it is what it is. Sometimes the RSVPs can be deceptive. So just want to encourage everyone that is open to going on video. We love to see you. So it's fun to be on video and sort of see people from around the world. Thanks, Jay, and for being on video, and Jerome, thank you as well. Want to give a quick introduction to the Freethinker Institute, which is the not-for-profit that Neville and I work together on. And basically, we are trying to help provide transformative personal and professional growth to increase happiness and decrease harm in the world. And we have this goal of creating a kind of a community of people who want to be the best version of themselves, where we help each other do that and seek truth. And we have an online community, which I'll post in the chat, a little bit more information about the organization. I'm going to post the YouTube channel and the online community link, and a little bit more information about the organization. And with that, I want to let Neville, do you have a presentation, or are you going to?
Yes. I'll need to share.
Great. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll let Neville share. And Neville, if you want to give a quick introduction for your background, you'll do it better justice than I will, although I know you'll introduce yourself better than I will. So I'll let you introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Yeah, so as Gareth says, I have recently come in to work with Gareth in terms of his Freethinker Institute, but I'm involved in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia, what we call the Philosophy Cafe Meetup. And that's sort of affiliated with what I call the Brisbane Intellectual Network. So, and that network, there are, and I imagine this is pretty common across the globe in terms of the meetup networks. But we have in Brisbane several what I call intellectual communities. The Stoics, for example, classic book clubs, which tend to be a little bit more than your sort of wine and dine type book clubs. We have Prometheus. We've got a Prometheus Society. So we ancient history seems to do quite well here, as more than probably those that are interested in modern philosophy. But nevertheless, that's what's happening here. And so I imagine that that's happening elsewhere. But what this is all about really is community education. That's what it's about. It's about communication. And this is what I'm going to be looking at today. So I'm going to just do my screen share and get into the presentation. Okay, so can you confirm that's all up and running?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Okay. So there is a sector in education, like we got primary, secondary, tertiary, or higher education, and this is a sector that's commonly known as community education, but it's not well defined or described in the literature. Often organisations are doing community education without knowing it, and without knowing the full potential within the organisation. As a historian, I would describe the past practices of community education, how the lack of information, it seems important that people have a basic vocabulary of the sector of community education. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm not going to do this as a lecture. I just think that's probably useless, and I think it'd be better to do a lesson where I just walk through around about 50 terms which describe the practices of community education. So these terms, in a sense, lay down the groundwork in understanding what community education is, and what it can be for organisations like the Free Thinker Institute, or for us, the Philosophy Cafe, or the Brisbane Intellectual Network, or whatever community organisation that people here might be associated or involved in. And that includes, groups like the San Diego Roundtable and so forth. So, there's plenty of organisations where I think this is very applicable. So I'll go through the PowerPoint, which is, yes, you'll see in a second, full of the graphics with the terms, and I'll pause after sort of giving, I won't say anything really to it. I've got a paper where I sort of give a little bit of introduction to each of these terms in the literature, but it's, it's like with 50 terms, it's like 50 pages. So I'm not going to really do that. I really think it's probably better that people sort of give their reflections from their practices, and as something that we can all kind of explore. So look, what I'm going to do first is, because there's so much, I'm just going to go through, there's only 7 slides here in the graphic, and I'm just going to quickly go through flash through the 7. So you can kind of just get a sense of where we're heading. And if we don't get to the end, that doesn't really matter. Okay. So, I start with community, some of the base central ideas in terms of community education. We can sort of then break that down into some basic ideas about community. These ideas tend to become now in the literature more sophisticated in terms that there are now multidisciplinary characteristics that are used to describe community. And then we can look at the concepts around education, and I've got 11, well, actually 10. You'll notice between here on the graph, I went from 08 to 10. Sorry, I'm not much of a good mathematician, but perhaps that's an opportunity for people to throw in something, as number 9. So a lot of this is sort of sociology, and then some of the key concepts in probably the last 30 years that have been used to as applications in community education. And of course, at the basis, at the foundation is philosophy. And so some very big ideas in terms of the way, not only the application of community education, but how people think about community education, and that then there's a lot of contesting, what we do. I mean, I'm sure people are aware of the sort of silly arguments and nonsense that goes on, that gets thrown at, our communities of education, in terms of what we're trying to do. And so there are these philosophical concepts that can sort of deconstruct, these problems. So let's go back to the concept of community education. So my argument would be the basic idea of community education is community. So, and you can unpack that. So maybe that's a good place to start, to commune, to become one. So what do people think? Maybe we can go in and out of the, if I can find Oh yeah, I'll stop screen share. Any thoughts about community? What does people have a particular view?
I work as a volunteer here in California with a community college, and we have a community education part of the college. And we also have an organization called ESCOM, which is Emeritus Students College of Marin, which is a group of people that come together without any necessary connection to the college. Anyone in the community can join ESCOM. And we operate a series of clubs. We have 25 different clubs. We have about 3,000 people on our mailing list. We have right now about 500 actually active people who attend the clubs. And we've been shut down, of course, from COVID like everybody else. And so everything's been offline now for the last 2 years. But we have a not quite so formally structured system as what you've shown me, but something that functions as a community education ongoing project. And our main problem is just getting people to come in, getting people who are interested in community education. We've got about 250,000 people in this county, and we've only got 3,000 of them on our mailing list, and we've only got 500 of them active. So our main thrust right now is to recruit more people to come in to existing programs.
Yeah,
I don't know that has anything to do with what you're doing, but anyway, that's what we're doing here in California.
that's good. Okay. Radio, and someone else. I'm going to keep these things fairly short, by the way, so about just a minute or two. So someone else I thought was trying to jump in. No.
Yes, this is Sanjay. How's everybody doing? It's so great. Thank you, Professor Bush. So basically, I was just going to say, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. So just like I think it was Professor Connor was saying, we have community-based learning. I teach the Human Services and Psychology Club. I lead a club. I bring in guest speakers, professionals, do the best I can. We try to do things on a shoestring budget, right? Because we're working with certain demographics across 10 counties. I also do community-based learning with 4-year universities. I love taking training courses. So professional development is very important. I'm doing a doctoral program in strategic leadership. Then I'm going to do another degree in law, one in business. And we try to teach them an interdisciplinary. So I noticed it's almost like a Montessori approach at the higher education, the community-based learning. And we're trying to add more of the interdisciplinary thing. Like Professor Connor said, we're trying to add clubs. I absolutely love it. They give us a lot of flexibility, wonderful supportive group. I teach at Southside Virginia Community College, and I teach for 4-year universities and love it.
Yeah, excellent. If you don't mind, I'll keep going. I think they're very good examples, I think, in terms of, how the activities of community education reads and understands the community, which is very diverse, very open. And I think, that's great. But as Jake said, I think, there are some structural issues that need to be explored. The structural issues, I think, come around the disciplines, which provides the literature on community education. So if you want to read about, the ideas and practices, structures and so forth on community education, they come out of sociology, they come out of education, of course. But there are also a number of philosophers that are working in this space. So Pesto, I don't know, Pestolo, I think Francis Plesio in an article back in 1996, he related to the concept in the article of community to the practice of sociology. And this was specifically for undergraduate education, but it was a community-based model that employed the concept of citizen scholars. So that's a good example, but the literature is scant, unfortunately. I mean, that's a good example for full case studies. But they're actually not that many, and particularly for case studies for the discussion of, and this is a particular concern of mine, for modern urbanization and community development. So that, you know, because the cities, often a lot of these, I don't know, in the Midwest, I mean, the historical tradition has been around the development of community colleges, that is liberal arts colleges, and then that's in some sense over time extended into community colleges. But, you know, we are talking about cities, we are talking about urban populations. And I think what you were saying about, Jay, about, you know, the challenges of bringing our, you know, population into community education, it's often the challenges around politics, which are sociologically based, you know, in terms of the way that people, that is the way that people read society, and the arguments that you, particularly in the American context, but that's been globalized, between, you know, libertarians who very much resist, you know, the communitarian framing, you know, that is, you know, I hope people are following me in terms of the language. So there is a particular language here. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, yeah, stop me. But yes, so yeah, communitarian ways of doing education is often seen as something bad, you know, whereas where we would see it as something that is good. And I think that's the basic challenge. One of the best books that I've seen in terms of sociology around urbanization and community development is John Lawrence's book in 2019 called Me, I think, communities in London or the UK. It's around the post-war shift that was occurring in the after World War II in the east end of London, the dock areas, and where the population, where government policies was to move the population out into the new satellite suburban towns of, you know, of the 1960s. And, you know, and associated with that was a development of what we call the red brick universities, which tended to have a much more communitarian sort of view of education. Okay. Any questions? Okay, right. Right. Okay. Whoops, sorry. Yeah. So, you know, there are some very basic ideas around community education, more specifically around, you know, as I say, a communitarian view. So, you know, we talked about community. So, you know, just quickly reading them out, and then maybe, you know, because of time, people then can elect to sort of make some comments about something that sort of resonates to them in terms of their practice, you know, and their experience of the practice. So, you know, we've talked about community, we've talked about, you know, community education, community belonging. You know, the concept of belonging is a particularly important way of reading, you know, what we're doing. Community formation and identity is particularly important. And again, in terms of that political debate and resistance, you know, that we experience, it's often because people's fears around identity politics, you know, which often is a lot of nonsense, but you know, there are genuine fears around, you know, of a collective sort of outlook. Community participation, which is hopefully the answer to those fears, that we, you know, in a sense, what we're doing is very much participatory. We want everyone being involved, you know, and all views being considered and contested, and you know, a search out for some consensus, wide consensus around, you know, a whole set of ideas. Community action. Well, you know, I don't really have to say too much about that in terms of that. In terms of my conversations with Gareth, I'm hearing this very strongly, that, you know, there's a concern that, you know, what we do is practical, that it has actual outcomes, you know, that it's not just a talk fest. Community and law. Well, you know, there's, you know, it's not an area. I mean, there's an article in the Law Review that talks about this, but it's not, I mean, not a lot of us, I suppose, across the disciplines, not a lot of us are sort of interested in law. Perhaps maybe some of us, there may be some here who are actually interested in law, but law does have a big impact in terms of what we do, in terms of the fact that we are struggling with the letter of the law and the spirit, you know, or the ethos of what we're doing, you know, and you know, these goes questions to limits and containment and so forth. Community and race, of course, is a big issue, and it's become, you know, it's become big at particular times. It was a major issue in the 1960s. It's actually returned as a major issue. And so, you know, what does a multi racial community look like, you know, and is that different? You know, one of the things I think the insights that I've sort of picked up on this is that we talk about multiracial society, but I don't think we have clear ideas of what that really means in terms of community, you know, and the dynamics there. And then, you know, global community, of course, since the 90s, has been a big issue. I don't know that I really need to say too much about that. Moral community, again, that sort of relates a little bit in terms of that conversation around community and law. There's been a lot of good critiques of morality from ethicists, in terms of that morality tends to be so rule-driven that it actually becomes something that's unethical. So, you know, there's questions about, you know, formations around communities that, you know, where morals are important, and it's not an argument about that morals are not important, but it's around about how we understand morality and ethics. Community faith, well, of course, religion comes into this, or spirituality comes into this. It's inescapable. You know, studies in the last 30 years, scholars in studies in religion like myself basically just see the collapse of the hard categories of the sacred and the secular, that they just no longer make sense to try and put these things into separate boxes. And then, of course, another major shift in the last decade has been an attention to Indigenous communities, you know, and trying to understand their formation. And so there we are. And so I'll pull out of this now and go back to the group, and just, we can have about a 5-minute conversation if you like, and see where that goes. Okay. So who wants to?
Yeah, I look at your circles there, and I see 12 sumo wrestling pits where people can get together and fight. And if I framed this way for my community, I'd have a problem, because it's an invitation to a fight in every case. We don't talk about libertarian versus communitarian. We avoid that. We talk about lifelong learning.
Yes,
lifelong learning bridges all of this. It has something for everyone. It doesn't raise these categories that like to fight with each other. it just focuses upon what you as an individual can get from a lifelong learning experience. And this can take, well, as I say, we got 25 different clubs, and the astronomy club is interested in astronomy, and the current events club, they like to fight, but
Sure.
the other philosophy of science club, we get together to learn about philosophy. There's a lot of opportunity to learn without getting in fights, and it requires a certain amount of focus, because we do have our libertarians and we do have our Republicans and people who want to fight. But as part of the college, our college is mandated by the state of California to provide space for us, to provide a place to meet and a time for meeting, and various facilities that go along with that. So we have facilities available in which we can operate. That's very helpful. And I know not everyone has that. I see meetups all the time that can't find a place to meet. And that's a problem that we've been able to sidestep. We also have, in connection with the college, a vocational training program that the college is building up, which trains people in lifelong learning ways of earning a living and new skills and that sort of thing. So there's a contribution in that sense of bringing people of all areas and people who are changing jobs or who want to change jobs to learn a new skill and start something new. I don't know how that fits in with what you're doing, but when I look at what
it does, Joe. It does. You know, so I'm not offering this as a source of conflict. And in fact, you know, I'm sort of working from Richard Hofstadter's sort of outlook in terms as a consensus historian. So this is about consensus. But I think the problem in terms of consensus historiography, you know, and I am a follower, if you like, or a supporter of Richard Hofstadter and those 1960s consensus historians. I think the problem is that, you know, you've also got to acknowledge conflict, and you've got to acknowledge, you know, that. So when you say to me, you know, we've got a population out there, and we want, you know, and you know, we're not seem to getting them in. I'm suggesting that, you know, it's the way that they read quietly, not vocalizing the conflict, but the way that they're thinking about community education through these different concepts, and they have problems with it. And instead of being conversive and sort of saying, well, I find this a bit problematic, you know, how can we think about this? You know, usually within the population, and it's often because, you know, this is pre-education, and people that are in a pre-educational state, they don't have the language to unpack the reasons why they're feeling like there's a problem. And it's probably true. They do have a problem with it. It's not to deny that it is a problem. There are problems out there, but it's that they don't have the language to say why they feel unhappy or uncomfortable in those sort of community education environments. You know, so that's what I'm trying to unpack here. Yeah, so that, you know, like if you take, say, faith communities, you know, if you've got an community educational environment that sort of seems to express faith communities that around that sort of concept, then that's going to have a certain reaction amongst a certain groups of people within the population, because they read that in particular ways. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Any other thoughts before we move on?
If you don't mind, I'd love to jump in on that, because Jay, I think what you're saying, if I understood right, is that there are certain controversial topics that are best avoided unless people opt into them. And I would agree that unless people opt into them, it's good to avoid them. But part of why I started the Free Thinker Institute in the beginning is we live in a very divided politically country, and I see a lot of misinformation thrown around, and both sides claim the other side has misinformation. And I think that through open-minded communication and listening to other people with an open mind and thinking for ourselves, and using our critical thinking skills and learning who we can trust and who we can't trust, I think we can actually have the real truth come forward through polite dialogue around even controversial topics. And that's why the one rule of the Free Thinker Institute is that we must always be polite at all times. That is the only rule. But we do require that everybody stay polite, because as soon as people get emotional, all logic goes out the window and people get into emotional arguments. And what I want to do is have polite conversations about what are historically, and even amongst my friends, I've gotten into emotional arguments about politics because of how heated things are now. And that's what made me realize it's so important that we do talk about these things, because if we don't, misinformation, the studies say that fake news travels faster than real news. And so the studies say that, the truth is not going to win unless we do have these polite dialogues about what truth is. And in fact, next week's session is about how to discern between what news is the real news and what news is the fake news. So I think it's really important that we be able to tackle the very controversial and difficult issues. I think people should opt into them. And so we prepare people that those are the topics we're going to talk about on the nights that we're going to talk about them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an ongoing program, and we give it ongoing attention.
Got it.
There are two excellent articles in this month's Atlantic on just exactly this: how to talk to your frenemies, how to talk to people you just don't agree with. Yeah. And it's something we have to constantly work with.
Yeah.
On the Atlantic too, I should say that I published a popular, become a very popular academic letter, with about 4,000, over 4,000 sort of hits or downloads and so forth. It's probably a smaller number in terms of some of the big players in the field, but it's nevertheless a fairly big number for me anyway. But it's called Finding Peace in the Cultural History Wars, a historiographical message. And I open up in terms of 2 Atlantic articles that I think well discussed the cultural history wars, and it drew out, for my argument, really an important understanding about historiography, that it's our reading of the past that leads us into a very false conflict, of the very manipulative cultural history wars. Kevin.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So I just wanted to reinforce, and of course I'm an associate of Jay's, because we're at the College of Marin together. Been there. I'm now retired software executive for 8 years, and been at the ESCOM Center with 2,500 members for that period of time. And we appreciate all that you're saying. Unfortunately, gravity applies, it seems, which in this case means age, and which means memory and recollection and context. It's hard to reach people. It's hard to reach people in a time in which they can remember that your services and your availability is out there. When COVID shut us down here in the States, or at least in California, our IT director, CIO, was kind enough to give us a dozen Zoom licenses. We ended up having all of our clubs that had 400 members a month meeting move online for the last 2 years, and now we have 700 people a month meetings. Now we're going back to hybrid, obviously, where we've been, at least here in California, we're back to some people going in, some people not going in, and that's going to do whatever it's going to do. I think you have to be careful with your model in a very broad context, which is it's very daunting. It's a daunting model, and even in Marin County, which is affluent, aged, and small, only 250,000 people in Marin County. And we're mostly lefties, but you got a lot of Trumpists here too. People are defensive with respect to understanding and what they know and what they have access to. But frankly, most of my cohort, I'm 74, and many of our cohort are in their 80s and older. They don't even know what they don't know. They don't even know. They don't even know what we offer, and they don't remember that we've offered it to them a dozen times. So we all have to remember. We all have to remember that it's an ongoing, recurring process. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
great
yes,
points, Kevin.
these are big philosophical conundrums that we in our lifetime that we've been dealing with. Yes, we're
Yeah, if I don't have the ears, my big mouth matters little.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Kevin.
No, sorry.
Oh yeah. All right. So I will move on if people don't mind, because there are quite a few other sort of things, and we can probably come to more compatibilist sort of outlook rather than the sort of conflicts that are so problematic. So yes. Right. Okay, so I think one of the problems that I think, so I mean, we get a backlash, in what we've been talking about in terms of a populist level, out there. But I think, unfortunately, I think that some of the problems actually are sort of of our own making, and that is, I think that traditionally higher education or tertiary education has been very much developed in silos of the discipline. So, I know that, I first worked really as a higher education policy researcher at Griffith University. And Griffith University is a small university in Brisbane, and it was part of a new wave of universities. I don't know that there are this particular model in the United States. But there was Griffith, La Trobe University, and Griffith were probably the two leading models. So what the model is they are multidisciplinary universities. So rather than having schools and departments in history, sociology, philosophy, et cetera, they have large multidisciplinary faculties, sorry, not factories. The slip of the tongue, but that may be true. But yes, no, the faculties, so the faculties work on that literature that tries to develop a multidisciplinary outlook. So, so when we look at community education, I think there are sort of concepts that have sort of been particularly strong in this sort of multidisciplinary literature. And I think, so we got collaboration, something this is sort of what I call, it's people talk about mutual awareness or mutual respect. I suppose I've got this fancy, title, mutualism, which I think comes from biology, actually. But I think you can get the idea. Resonancy, I think, is important, concept. So part of, my multidisciplinary package is, I'm a historian of urbanization, and so there are real issues around transient populations, who lack a certain sense of resonance. So that we're talking, and then that relates to the next one, you know, in terms of neighbourhoods. And neighbourhoods, I think, is a different concept to residency, but, you know, but obviously related. And I think it obviously is a big a topic that in the literature that is on community education. There's a slice of the literature that talks about, I suppose, loyalties, and, you know, on the more conservative side of the thinking, loyalties is an important theme or important idea or concept. Well, not so much a concept. I think more an ideal that's important in terms of the practice of what you want to encourage amongst students. Then there's, you know, then in the 1990s, in terms of the neoliberal economy, then, you know, people started talking, in the literature started talking about stakeholders in terms of community education. And so, you know, I find this a little bit problematic, you know, because it suggests that certain groups of people have greater claims, greater stakes in the practice and the operation of community education than other people. That's a sort of an inference, perhaps, but that's, you know, something that can be tested and so forth. And then finally, you know, a big area, of course, of community education is around therapy, you know, psychotherapy and new age thinking, you know, in terms of what various community educational organizations might offer. So, you know, and that's something that, you know, again, a sort of contested area, and, you know, that people can talk about. Okay, so let's have a look at that and talk about that for about 5 minutes. Surely amongst those sort of issues, around issues of how we do collaboration, how we encourage mutual respect and awareness, what's the sense of resonancy that we do, and so forth. Yeah,
I think sometimes the people here seem to feel that as far as learning is concerned, you're either a student or you're done with it. There has to be an openness to lifelong learning and an understanding that learning is a lifelong process and never ends.
Yeah.
But
it's in my list, by the way. It is in my list. We're getting there.
And what we end up getting is you got the students, and the students, we all know who they are, and they're the ones that are number one in the college.
Yeah.
And then you've got the retired people who come into ESCOM, and that's kind of when you come in. And in the middle, there's this group of people that we're largely missing. That they figure their education's done until they retire, and then they can do things that are amusing.
Yeah.
And I'm still wondering how you can get a wider participation in a community education program. How do you break into that middle group? They're busy. Yeah. They got a lot of things to do, a lot of competition for their time. And we have trouble getting their attention.
Yeah. And I think that this again goes to how people read community education. So and it sort of is on the broader canvas around the thinking around education in the last 30 years. So governments, you know, read education as, you know, for the job market, you know, it's getting people into jobs. That's how governments read education. So, and that's not community education, really. even if there were jobs that people could get into, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's not the heart, if you like, or the soul of community education. So that's the challenge, I think. You know, I think you're going to have, again, one of the other sort of irons in the fire that I have in terms of my multidisciplinary sort of approaches, that is that I'm looking at history and the philosophy of personality and persons and personhoods. There actually has been a philosophical movement called personalism, and so there's a lot of thinking around, types of people, persons, personalities, and I think which is not the language of psychology, but it's the language of people's passions, and I think that's the thing. I mean, you're just not going to tap into that middle sector, that middle population, if with anyone that doesn't have, I think, some disposition to an interest in social interaction, which is another concept that I'll bring up. Interest in in humanity or humanism, or all these sort of themes of the humanities and social sciences. You're just not going to tap into them. I made a comment recently because I've been in a bit of a dispute with our Lord Mayor in Brisbane, and the point that I made, in that letter was that we have, local councillors and politicians, federal and state, who, most of them never did a course in humanities or social sciences, or if they did, they must have been asleep in the classroom. So you're just not going to get those type of personalities, I'm going to get someone that I think has there's some stage of life that they're going to feel, society is important, humanity is important, and all these sort of things.
So if I can, Neville, I'd like to propose a way that we might be able to get their attention. And the Freethinker Institute has sort of two tracks: personal development and professional development. And I'd argue the way to get mid-career people's attention is say, we'll help you get a promotion. We'll help you do better in your career. We'll help you be more successful and make more money. They all want to know how to do those things. And we can help them do all those things. Like I taught a class in how to set your life's goals, achieve them in a state of flow. Like if you're in a state of flow during your work, you're going to be way more successful. You're going to be way more likely to get a promotion in your job. And if you talk about some of the things that we've taught in the community, savings and investment, how do you retire? I taught a class on how you can retire at age 65 when you graduate college making minimum wage in New York City. And you can retire as a millionaire making as much money as you did when you retired, except you're not working anymore. So, those are the types of skills that everybody, especially mid-career people, especially early career people, honestly, need to know, because their career trajectory depends on that kind of insight and information. And so that's actually, Jay, the kind of stuff that I'd love to talk to you about when we talk offline about ways that we can collaborate between our communities, because there are ways that my community can benefit yours and vice versa. And things that I think we can do to engage those mid-career people by doing what they want, right? Helping them achieve their goals, which is what this is all about, is helping people achieve their own goals, not just achieving our goals by helping them learn what we want to teach them, but helping them achieve their own goals.
Yeah, I'm not against this sort of pragmatic sort of approach. I mean, my comments only said it's not the high end of ethical.
I love
thought,
and I know, Neville,
by all means.
I do always try to bring it back to the practical, Neville, but I love to geek out about philosophy. So like I was the one that hosted the conversation on free will, and I started the whole conversation like, yeah, this isn't really practical because we all accept that it's better to treat it like we have free will, whether we do or not. But let's just talk about it anyway. And it was a fun conversation. We got a huge turnout, and it was a lot of fun, and people like geeking out about it. But a little bit of geeking out is fun for those of us that enjoy it. But a lot of what I want to focus on is adding value to people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, the carrot. It's the carrot, and and I suppose fair enough. Some people have to participate because there's a carrot there, so fair enough.
And let's have the carrots. And go ahead, Kevin.
So Gary, the only clarification I want to make: how can you possibly consider free will since you can't even define consciousness?
So I can define consciousness and I can define free will, but that's a, I would recommend that you, I actually can not only define consciousness, Kevin, I will argue that I can actually define how consciousness works, which is a very bold claim, but that's a conversation for another night. I would love for you to watch our recording on free will, and then let's have a sidebar on it on the online community. I'll post the links to the online community again, and I'd love to talk to you about free will there, especially after you've watched my presentation about how I defend free will. But again, we're geeking out here on community education. It's supposed to be about community education.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the practical. But it's a fun conversation. And Kevin, you can't blame me for saying any of that, because you might think I was predetermined to do it, in which case it's not my fault. So
Exactly. No. And I'm so pleased that Neville is here to ground us back to the philosophical view of
exactly.
Yeah. And I think that, it just underlies, I think that in many ways that there is, I think, philosophically, an understanding of different personalities, and some people just will not engage in that type of educational process in terms of philosophy or even sociology in a more abstract way. So but then there are those of us for which it's very, very important. So all means, all methods. Just to move on. Okay, so perhaps we can unpack the concept of education a little bit more and get into that. So, a key concept that educationalists talk about is community-based learning. There's specific ideas about what occurs as learning in those community educational environments. In terms philosophically, I would say I'm a constructivist, amongst other sort of different labels that you might sort of put on me as well. But, I think that rather than seeing education as perennial blocks of ideas that just don't change, across time, but basically, I think the vast majority of educationalists basically see that the sort of learning that we do is a process of constructing a way to think, and I think that's certainly, what critical thinking is about. It's about, tools, it's about process. Schooling. I'm actually doing a major paper for the 50th anniversary of the journal called The History of Education Review. I'm a member of it's for the organisation which I'm a member, active member, the Australian and New Zealand History of Education Society, and I'm doing this paper with Michael Macklin, who was an Australian interpreter of Ivan Illich. Sorry for those that are not in the educational circle here, but in the 1970s, basically in the 1970s, there were a whole lot of educational theorists who sort of revolutionized the way we think about schooling, and challenged it in some ways. And then sort of the shift was from institutional concepts of schooling to student-based needs in learning. Okay. If you have any questions about the language and what I'm saying, please, ask me to clarify. Educational programming, that's sort of, in the last, particularly the last 30 years with the digital revolution, that's the drilling down from the theories and drilling down to actual creating, course programs. And so there's a lot of discussion around there in terms of the ideas and the concepts that sort of get employed there. One paper that I'm looking at is actually how that's been done pre-digital. That is way back in the early 20th century in terms of the course programming of the organization called the Workers' Educational Association. And I've been doing history on that. And, but, I'm not going to get sidetracked, but if you want to know, I can tell you about that. But the history of going back to these organisations, Fabian, this was Fabian organisation in Britain that was established in Britain that spread out the Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand and Canada. And it really was the beginnings of the adult education movement, liberal adult education movement, which politically or ideologically crossed that boundary, which really I don't see in history really sort of exists too much, between social liberals, in terms of someone like Stuart Mills, James Stuart Mills, and Bertrand Russell, and then sort of the socialists, the British socialists that were associated with the Bloomsbury group. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization and ideas, that produced by the mid-century this sort of movement of adult education.
Mm-hmm.
Training. Now, this is particularly because I heard Jay talk about training, and this is the real challenge, because it's a key significant point that I make in terms of the 20th century history, is that you on one side you had this community adult education movements, but you had also technical colleges, and technical colleges basically created, I think, a strong sense within society that education was about training, and certainly training is part of education, but in some ways it's in social attitudes it's become reductive. So there's a large slice of the population for which education is only training, and it goes no further than training. In some sense, that extends into the modern movement of service learning, so that universities now are contracted with industry to teach things like tourism. And so education is sort of moved into this new area of what they call service learning, which is sort of, creating the idea that education is a service, certainly, in terms of what we see in community education. But this idea that, again, the twist is that it can become a bit reductive, so that you learn only what you need to do in terms to serve other people. In some ways, it's a lack of self-care, which is another concept I'll talk about later, which is that rather than seeing education as something for flourishing of the person, it's just simply you become a tool in the economic system. Okay, lifelong, there we are, Jay, lifelong learning, and Jay has already made a few comments about that, so that's fine. John Dewey talks a lot about, in his literature, the key concept from John Dewey is subject matter knowledge, and that really sort of knowledge is essentially linked to the subject and defined by the subject, and that's a double meaning there, the subject of the learning, but also the subject of the learner. And of course, I've seen the literature, the populist feedback, the newspaper, magazine articles, so the hype around this term critical pedagogy in the United States. We don't have that sort of reaction in Australia. Most Australians know that critical pedagogy, or if they know the term, know that this has been going on since the early 80s. So, I find it rather shocking, surprised, when I hear the outrage around critical this concept of critical pedagogy in the American news. It's like, for God's sakes, it's been going on for about 40 years. So, and it's only really sort of about, I suppose it's really creating those critical categories in the learning, no more than that. It's obviously been reacted to because concepts of race, gender, sexual orientation tends to come to the fore, but it's really about, a critical reading of the sociology. And, and so you have to say, in terms of the broad critical thinking movement, which cuts across both sides of politics, that's an extension of critical pedagogy. You would not have the critical thinking movement if it wasn't for, the introduction of critical pedagogy in the early 1980s. So, any thoughts there, or any reflections? Yeah, Kevin.
So, and again, I think I always enjoy it's like I was on the business and the private sector side, so I think of strategic and tactical thinking. And I believe you're dealing with a high end of philosophical macro views of societal issues around community education.
Can I give you a term, Kevin, which is, I think, coming up? It's called framing. So, I'll let you explain yourself, but yeah. So, but what I will say is that, again, I don't see there's any conflict between framing and practice.
Oh, except reality. only in the sense of we in the States have a lot of bloviators, as you well know, Neville. And we get a lot of noise. We get a lot of noise in our political, socioeconomic, business, press, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. The only comment I was going to make specifically to your summary of a moment ago was that I have to confess, I'm a broadly educated person because I was in a military family, U.S. Navy, and traveled a lot. Lived in Europe, lived all over, blah, 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 blah. And it's also my inclination, so blah, blah, blah. But I think that you could almost argue, and I could certainly see the argument that brainwashing people is manipulative and also just doesn't allow them to learn. But one could argue that even however bad education was, as long as I gave it to everybody, and it was supposed to be in a democratic, liberal democracy environment, supposed to be broadly educational, because God knows in America we can't get past the first sentence and agree on the first thing about what public education should look like. But one could argue that considering the dynamics of the human brain, and that all it is endlessly curious in my humble opinion.
Yes.
The human brain is endlessly curious, and therefore once you trip it into something informational, most people, unless they have many people, I'm not going to say most, let's say many people will simply just chase that thing down the lane to its logical conclusion. Yeah. I don't care what their painful source of bullshit that they got there. The point was that they got there, they realized that there was another source of information besides their head.
Yeah, I agree. It's a process, isn't it? And it's an imperfect, fallible process.
Oh, it's very painful to recognize that pain and error can actually stimulate growth and prosper.
Yeah, yeah, and the key, I think, is as educators is that we make students comfortable with the fact of living with their own mistakes, that making mistakes in life is not the problem.
Oh, it's the
You know,
only
we've
basis
got
of,
to learn. Yeah.
it's
Yes.
the only basis of learning.
Yes.
For most of us, it's the only basis of learning. I keep stubbing my toe enough, I realize I won't do that one more time. At least intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like to think there's more than that.
Well, of course, in a dumb kind of way, you know, in a dumb kind of.
Yeah. I agree. We're habitual. We are definitely habitual, and so you know, yeah, we learn from our mistakes, and so that's true. But you know, but there are also, I think, you know, for other sections of the population, we don't always have to stub our toes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the nature of what's the theme? Get them young and get them in a cult, right?
Oh well.
Hmm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts
By the
or
way,
move on?
by the way, thank you for this. Enjoying it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah,
job.
and I agree with you in terms of too about we've got to make some differentiation between in course programming between what we understand as propaganda and what we understand as liberal adult education. It's there's a whole lot of literature. I certainly, I'm a reader of Jacques Ellul, I think he started a lot of, in sociology, I think sort of started this conversation around what propaganda is. So, that's a big topic. Yeah. So we'll move on, and it's really good because we sort of, I think there's a commonality, for us, because we seem to be moving through fairly quickly, which means that I think we sort of probably have a lot of deal of similar experience, similar practices, and so forth. And as Gareth's, I think, saying in terms of what he wants to do in the free thinkers institutions, is that we can very much help each other, and I think what he wants to have at some point is to have that conversation about how we might practically help each other in this larger enterprise. So sociology, but basically, people probably can pick this up. I've been walking through, educational theories. But I've also been walking through the philosophy of education, which is the last slide that sums up it. It looks like we will actually get to it. But there's also this large field of sociology of education as well. So, and there are some key concepts that relate to sociology specifically, and citizenship, I think, is probably a major key concept, particularly within, for those that don't know me, and I'm a historian of American and Australian intellectual thought. So, and for both Australian and most, of course, Commonwealth countries, most Western democracies, citizenship is a key concept in terms of particularly what government or what the state expects in terms of what we deliver specifically in community education. And there's a key concept in the literature that's called citizen scholar. So there's this idea that in some sense, you can see the screen? Oh, sorry. Yep. Yeah, right. Citizen scholar. Some of the papers talk about this concept of citizen scholar. That what we want to encourage in students is that they can become participatory scholars themselves. As citizens of the country, as members of the community. And so this is a little gray area in terms of you know, how we read communities in terms of, you know, nations and citizens of nations, you know. So, you know, it's not I don't see it's conflictual. I just see it's as something that's layered, but it's a little bit grey in terms of, in terms of, I suppose it's pushing students and people in the population to be able to have that capacity to think at different levels, you know, rather than a sort of, you know, in the politics, you often get a knee-jerk reaction because politicians manipulate it. They manipulate a particular level of identity, and it's probably trying to help, you know, counter that by getting people to understand I'm a citizen of a nation, but I'm also a member of a local community. I'm a member of a hobbies community. I'm a member of a particular worldview community or faith community, moral community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, class and change. Again, you know, these terms can be flags even now, which surprises me because, you know, I've had decades and decades, and I'm sure you people have had decades and decades, talking about class, talking about social change. You know, it's no big deal for us, but, you know, again, it's an area that which can be red flags on a particular side of, more on the conservative side of politics. But I think in some ways, you know, I think in 2022, you know, amongst conservative intellectuals and social liberals, intellectuals, you know, or socialists or radicals, and whatever sort of terms that, you know, there's a strong consensus around that class is a factor and social change is a factor, and so we've got to deal with that. Then sort of drilling down a little bit more, you know, is to make and connecting it to our understanding of community and community education is, if you go into the history, you know, basically in the earliest histories, you know, community was thought of as parishes, or they were thought of as shires. Parishes, you know, strongly linked to the ideas of sacred, to church communities. But, you know, when you really look and explore the history, you actually find that the sacred and the secular overlapped, because parishes were also in the British system. Parishes are measurements of land, boundaries, you know, so land areas in British and Commonwealth countries are described as parishes, and they're also described as shires. So as landscape, that's how communities get defined, as in one way, in a major way, is in terms of that they are locked in or bounded by this landmass, which is a shire of, or the parish of such and such. You know, the big movement in when I sort of, you know, started my scholarly life in the 1980s, the big term amongst the people I was working with was community development. That's now a very old concept, and also links into, I suppose, concepts of development, international development, you know, in terms of, you know, what we used to call third world development and so forth. So, yeah, you know, this idea that the communities aren't static, again, it's, you know, they've got to go somewhere, you know, it's again, so the link to community education, it's that, you know, we want to develop with both, you know, it's neither either or, it's both developing an individual flourishing, but also developing a sense of community and support and the way that people work together in society, which goes then to, you know, what's social interaction? What do we mean when we say that people interact together and work together? And so that's another part of the literature. And then sustainability, again, has been something in the last decade that's often, of course, talk. It's not simply, although it is very much in a big way driven around our concerns about climate change and the reforms within the economy, within society, what we've got to do in terms of the challenges of the climate impacts on the environment. But there is a bigger story there as well in terms of economic models, of sociological models, broader sociological models, and certainly environmental models around, how we have all these wonderful ideas, but and in some ways it picks up on Gareth's point, which I accept, is that we can put carrots out there for these persons that are just in it for themselves. But that's the problem, you get then people that come into community education, come into the whatever education sector, take what they want and then leave. And so it's like you're seeing society as a tool that they can use for their own benefit, but they're not really concerned about the benefit of society, and they're not concerned about the same sustainability of the actual social structure that actually enables them to have those personal benefits. So there we are. Thoughts? I'm not sure how to read silence often.
One thing that I personally, and I think many people also are worried about, education itself, it's the cost of education. That
Yes.
seems like an extremely big barrier to expanding. I mean, I'm not saying there's a dearth of information online. If you want to learn anything, it's possible to get like everything online. And there's so much information out there, it kind of feels overwhelming for many people. And
Okay, can I just pause you there, because there are different concepts here that's important. So information is not education. Information gathering is perhaps part of the process of learning, but it's not the whole process. So, and this is why it's important to try and to drill down in terms of what we actually mean when we talk about information being online, and everyone can sort of be involved in the learning process and so forth and so forth. Because often social media, as we know, can doesn't produce learning. It can just merely enforce pre-existing prejudice, and there's no process of learning that occurs. So education is a much bigger process than sort of information gathering, which research, if you like. Research certainly is important. I'm not disparaging it, but you can't just sort of gather the material, sort of put it into a report. There we are. It's a bigger process.
Okay. And another thing I am personally also worried about, is the current state of K through 12 education. I mean, it's to be honest, it's really disappointing. I do not look highly into K through 12 education in the sense that normal schooling methodology, it's if it's public or private, if it's in a third world country or in a first world country or whatnot. The thing is, it seems very disappointing to me. It's inefficient in the sense that people who would want to move forward are kind of bound by, let's say, the average, basically. That's one thing. Another thing that I worry about K through 12 education is the environment it creates, like the social environment you create. I am so sure that everyone over here remembers that from a child to your 12th grade in school, you're surrounded by a certain group of people, day in, day out. There's a kind of a hierarchy or sorts, and then suddenly when you get out, your social environment changes completely, and it's a completely different. People say that it's a completely different world, and I wonder sometimes, even having gathering education and that kind of an environment has impact on learning. I mean, these are just random thoughts that I'm having. I mean, but yeah, I was wondering what other people thought about that as well.
I mean, certainly, I think education was so disappointed. So I don't think that there's no sense that you know, that we've arrived and that we've got all the answers, and that there are, and certainly there are a lot of, there's agreement that there's a lot of problems in the practice. I think, you know, what you're saying is actually comes out of Ivan Illich and his book on in terms of the criticism of schooling. So, you know, it wasn't an abandonment of the ancient idea of the school, but it basically said the modern concept of schooling, which developed in the 19th century, you know, basically was flawed. And that picks up a lot, I think, a lot of things that you said. Sorry about pronunciation, I can't quite. Yes. So yes, so you know, I think, and this paper that I'm working on is looking at what Michael Macklin was doing in Australia in terms, and other educationalists were looking at in terms. There were a lot of experimental programs in the 1970s that sort of tried to break the school model, the 19th century modern school model, you know, with, you know, people sitting, kids sitting in rows and rows and rows, you know, in front of the teacher, and, you know, so some of that has become mainstream and some of it, you know, didn't gel. And so I'm going to try and look at what was taken up and what wasn't taken up. But unfortunately, I think overall, we still have these, as you say, a hierarchical concept from this 19th century model of schooling.
If I believe that I've read that the American system is technically based on the Prussian, the schooling system that was originally in Prussia, modern day Germany, and there's always been this agreement that, you know, the public education is, you know, is somewhat of a system made by the government to indoctrinate, or let's say not necessarily educate, just to keep people smart enough so that they can get jobs, but not to, you know, universally make them too questioning. And, you know, that's a disappointment as well. It's this drops a little in, you know, when you go to college, and, you know, when you have freedom to take as many classes as you want. But then again, even in college itself, I see some people, you know, just this rat race of just getting the grades that you want, or, you know, getting the job that you want. You know, it's I don't have the answer. It's just disappointing. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and we would all agree with that, I think. Yes. Yeah. Kevin?
I admire the questions, and I don't even empathize. I understand them completely that the previous person made comments about. I would just say, going back to your comments, or your later comments in the presentation, Neville, that to me, some would argue that medical care is critical, and that's the number one. But to me, education is the prima facie absolute resource that everybody has to have the opportunity to be exposed to, pursue at the least cost possible and the least friction possible. Because we in the States here are a republic, and by definition, we're a republic of states, and the states all control the education system in each of the 50. And you can't, you know, Mississippi.
Isn't California Democrat? Or am I wrong?
Well, but I'm talking about the US of A. I mean, you look at Mississippi. Mississippi's education system is perhaps back in the 19th century that you were referring to in your example, particularly when it comes to people of color. And yet there's absolutely no way in the United States to get people to broaden that opportunity. So I'm about my single biggest, my number one mantra is, man, get education and information into everybody's hands. And so I would only argue tactically with the previous questioner's observation about the futility and frustration and philosophical angst around the relative merits of maybe we're being driven by a capitalist, or maybe we're being driven to be educated to get a job but not go further. Well, let me tell you, man, the human brain doesn't allow that to happen that way. The human brain gets excited and it starts getting more and more curious, not less curious. And so I think any education is critical. And the last point I want to make is we're drowning in information, we're drowning in debt, and we're drowning in currency worldwide. And people have to, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but people have to take responsibility and parse that out and slow down. They have to slow down. Now, and that's the point of being 20, 30, and 40. You got energy, you got time, you burn it. That's what you do. Because the whole point of being, you have to establish you have to establish oneself in the world so that you can then start being more productive later in your life.
You know,
as a lot of energy in your 70s, Kevin, if I can say.
Well, can I go to that?
Mid 70s here, mid 70s.
That's what I'm saying. Like, you're still going strong, my friend. I appreciate that. I hope I have that energy at 70s. So.
Kevin, are you in California?
Yes, Northern California, north of San Francisco.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So there's some key important points here. First, in terms of the conversation between you and the previous speaker, I'm sorry, Sue Sounder. I can't deal with pronunciations. I'm sorry. It's not a deliberate slur. It's just simply the way my brain works. So yes. So I don't think it's about resignation, and Kevin's passion, I think, is right in that sense. So I think, it's about critical thinking, but it's also about dissenting. So, we, as Gareth often says, we have what we have. I've mentioned that a few times to me. We have what we have. So we got the state system, right? Even if it, even if it's private education, it operates within a state system, right? So it is what it is. And I think, but the thing is, we can dissent. We can, there are forces of dissension, that can sort of, I think we don't have to completely resign, and we can move into critical thinking and so forth, etc. You know what I'm talking about. The second point, though, is, is the fact that in terms of the establishment, there was this shift. And so I'm going to suggest that perhaps Kevin's way of viewing things is perhaps shaped a little bit, not in terms of involvement in the 1970s, but a little bit earlier in terms of Clark Kerr's Californian model of higher education. Now, I don't know if you've seen the book, but Simon Marginson, who I had a little bit of work with when I was at the University of Melbourne. He's a professor of education. Now was at Melbourne. He's at Stanford, although I think he might be very close to retirement. He'll certainly be an emeritus professor because he's the authority on higher education, and particularly higher education and the economy. And so, he's written this book. He's written this book a couple of years ago on Clark Kerr's California model of higher education, which was very liberal, which was, which in terms of course programming was around the electives, that students could elect a way of creating a program of education based on their student needs in terms of where they saw themselves going in life, whether that was going to be around a job, or whether that was going to be around a career, or whether it was just going to be simply around a life mission or a worldview. So that model, was very operative. Began, in the 60s. Rolled out very strongly in the 1970s. but then it's really sort of folded. And Stuart Professor Simon Martinson has basically explained the economic factors that has led to the demise of this model. But articulating the virtues and the benefits that it produced, and and suggesting that that we've got to deal with certain economic challenges around mass education before we can actually then sort of perhaps return, or it'll never be a return, but it may be bringing. What we got to bring back is those virtues, though, whether it's going to be that particular, the structural model that Clark introduced, and there's problems there. I mean, Clark Kerr, has been criticised in, the problems. It's all fallible. So, but there's possibilities for the future there. I think, but it means actually tackling the economics of mass education.
Yep, and in our view, I'll speak for Jay as well. In our view, locally here, it's you just keep doing it. You just keep doing it. You keep you just keep hammering them. You keep focused on intergenerational education. You stay engaged.
Well, but with respect to K-12, I've been engaged in K-12 education almost continuously with children and grandchildren since 1962. And my parents never had that problem. My parents had one menu, no options, go to school. And that was it. And everything I have had to do as I raised my own children and helped raise my own grandchildren has been trying to find some place that works for my kids. And there were options. There were lots of options available. But boy, did you have to chase them. You had to chase them. You had to be willing to change. You had to get involved. You had to get engaged, because there was an awful lot of crap out there and a lot of things that you just could not put up with. And by dancing around within this system, my children and grandchildren have most of the time been able to get a really excellent education. But boy, did it take a lot of work. There was almost nothing given to you. You had to go out and find Montessori for this kid, and find an alternative high school for this other kid, and find dyslexic education for a grandchild, and it's all there, but you have to fight to get it now.
Yeah, and that's what we mean by community participation, isn't it? Yeah, that the struggle to participate, the struggle to get people to participate, the struggle to get the state to participate, the struggle, it's a struggle of participation. Is it not?
Yeah.
I was wondering though, what people's take here would be on, homeschooling. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I know that the basic problems with homeschooling, economic problems basically, and time problems. School to me, K through 12 seems like extended daycare, to be honest, for most people. But for efficient learning, and if time was possible by both parents, somehow to be, I feel that homeschooling would be the best form of education. Now, when I say homeschooling, I do not mean take this child away from the community all the way. I really do believe sports is, really, really important, and that might as well develop the social side enough. But in terms of efficient learning quickly, and after all, a child needs more time in his life, which is just like you study for a little bit, do it efficient, and then play the whole day. I mean, I was just wondering what people thought of homeschooling here.
I think homeschooling is the worst example of education that I can think of. Homeschooling, as I have observed it with some of the people that I have known, is essentially trying to turn your children into you, not allowing them to have a different religion, most particularly, not allowing them to learn the things that you don't want them to learn, keeping them in your model and doing it not particularly competently. There are certainly talented teachers who are also parents, but homeschooling, as I see it, is an attempt to clone yourself.
Is this a judgment for the masses? I mean, I agree with you.
No, this is just a judgment from my own experience with people who have homeschooled their children and with homeschooled situations that I have seen. I've seen a couple that worked really well, but most of it, it's not intended to educate. It's intended to indoctrinate.
Yeah, I would argue that it can be done well. And Shaunak, I see where you're coming from in that you get one-on-one attention from the teacher, but it's also super economically inefficient, because if you look at it, it's like one person teaching, 1, 2, maybe 3 kids, so, whereas a class, you have 20 kids that you're teaching at once, it's economically way less efficient. And most of the reason people do homeschooling is to like protect them from ideas that are mainstream societal ideas. And, sort of similar to what Jay's saying, where you want to teach them non-mainstream ideas and keep them only believing those ideas long enough in their life that they will believe them, ideally from your perspective, for the rest of their lives. I do know, again, people who are homeschooled that turned out very well balanced, like intelligent people that, are great. But like, the idea of having, like, for me, like I have thought a lot about what's fair and what's just in society. And one of the things that I think is inherent to fairness is that everybody gets an equal opportunity to education. And someone who is homeschooled does not have an equal opportunity to education, in that they're only getting educated by their parents, right? They don't get educated by a sort of an objective, educator, that is like grounded in society's morals and beliefs. They're getting educated by a party of one. And so that's really not a well-grounded education that that I think makes sense for most people. Again, not saying that, and it's legal, so it's perfectly, like, it's a legitimate thing to do, but I think often it can often I think it's done for the wrong reasons, is what it comes down to.
I understand the worries here with homeschooling. I it's mostly like people want to shield them from society and all that. Completely agree with that. And I've heard of people who do that. There are stereotypes out there. I'm just saying, if it was possible, the economics of it is, it's like you need a 2-parent income family these days, if you're middle class or even upper middle class, to and it's just not possible. I get that. But from an efficiency standpoint, and provided that the parents are good teachers, they focus on logic, reading, writing, and all that kind of stuff, which, sometimes I think K through 12 education isn't that, it's not difficult,
Yeah, can I use this conversation as a lead into my final slide, final sort of set of points here, and we can close off in terms of a discussion, because in some sense, and we raised it before, I think, in terms of that framing is not in conflict with the practice, and you've got to look at it from both sides. So you guys were talking about, discussing virtues or the vices, the virtues and vices of homeschooling. But it is a historical model. There's probably a few historical models, but I think for our 20th century and the 21st century, or at least the first part of 21st century, the model has been Jeremy Bentham and James Mill's model of homeschooling for John Stuart Mill's. And so you have perhaps could see that as a more beneficial homeschooling model. But when you again dig into the history, you find that it wasn't completely satisfactory for even for John Stuart Mills himself. Certainly in terms of his criticism of the sort of education that Jeremy Bentham had, in terms of liberal thought. So so you get what I mean. People look at homeschooling depending on their framing, and I think this goes to Jay's point about that often, not always perhaps, but often in this homeschooling American model of homeschooling, and it's been exported globally, and we have had the model here, particularly amongst Christian communities, not surprising in terms of the American model here in Australia, and the same sort of criticisms have been made in terms of that sort of framing around parents wanting just to produce, their worldview for their children, because it's the Christian way. That's the sort of argument. But, so framing is important here, I think. It's a way that various programs of homeschooling, how it's been framed, which leads into ideology and anti-ideology. I mean, it's a bit of a nonsense argument, I think, in terms of my research and writing. It's around, I think, alarmist and fear concerns around, this word ideology. You get a lot of people that, hold to a anti-ideology stance. But when you sort of dig and you sort of get them to explain what they're thinking, it's usually like, it goes along like this: ideology is the problem that's causing all these problems. You get this new, you get to these fashions, these trends. I mean, the latest one is the woke, and I don't understand it. I just think there's a lot of nonsense talk around woke, and I don't, because I can't understand, I can't get a grip to it, because it really seems to be a lot of around about fear around what people think is ideology, and the argument then sort of is like, ideology is the real problem, woke is the problem, but I'm not ideological. I'm not ideological at all. I'm completely purely not ideological. So there's a really misunderstanding around systems, poor systems thinking, very poor systems. Where then sort of then, in terms of, again, the conversation around that tends to then goes to value systems. And again, I'll let, that's mixed, the conversations that I hear around value systems. There's a lot of good talk around value systems, I suppose. But there are also a lot of problems, I think, in the way that people think about values being systematized. It's not, people, personal values that people have, and particularly around education, is not often nicely packaged and not nicely, systematized in the ways that people think that is. Then that sort of goes to the spirit, I mentioned earlier around, the theme of community and law. And, and again, it's this conversation that we've had since Hegel around spirit. And the problem, of course, with Hegel was that, he saw the state as the central feature in the unfolding of history. And, in terms of the spirit of the age, the spirit, world spirit, and so forth. And so we place too much an emphasis on state, and that's been a particular problem. I noticed, though, in the literature that Hegel is being revived in another way, not in terms of his perhaps naive understanding of the role of the state, but in terms of phenomenomic or phenomenomic communities, what's called phenomenomic communities. Communities of spirit is basically sort of this central idea. And then a large area of the literature, has been around caring in education, and also adjunct to that, or very much part of it, is self-care. So they are my 5 final sort of ideas in terms of the philosophy of education. And I think they sum up, I think in many ways, in terms of a lot of the concepts and ideas. And look, we could add more, I'm sure, or just, another slightly perspective, in these things. But I think those 5 sort of, for me, sort of, I think is very summative. So, any thoughts? Framing, ideology and anti-ideology, value system, spirit, caring, and self-care. Because I think these concepts have got to be, they do have to be practical. They've got to be rolled out in the practice of what we do. We've got to understand how we frame our, what we're doing. We've got to understand, even though I agree with Jay, we don't want, conflictual situations, but as Gareth explains, we've got to help people be aware that there is conflict out there, but there are compatible ways that we can sort of get ourselves out of those conflicts. Values, I think, are still very important, but then it's the way they're used in practically, people can sort of, I think, distort the lessons because they can be very selective about values, and then again, it becomes a conflict. And I'm not talking about value systems as conflict. I'm talking about ways that we understand that values can sort of line up, can be compatible with each other. Spirit, the fact that it's not just about training, it's about the fact that we want individuals to flourish. And that means, not only self-care, as I made the point that I made before, the frustration I have with libertarians, or hard libertarians, is that they don't realize that the social fabric, the social structures are there for their own benefit. And if they were diminished in the way that I think that a lot of libertarians sort of argued, then, they will lose their own benefits, because that is structure supports, egotistical, and I'm not using it as a negative term, but I'm in terms of ethical egotism, which can be a positive thing. I think, ethical egotism is supported by the social structure, and without it, and that's why community education.
That's a good lead into what we're going to talk about. Another. I don't know when we're going to hit it, but I have a paper on altruism, and what I would argue is that altruism is in our best interest, and if so, altruism and egoism are not at odds with each other. They're actually one and the same. If you're an altruist, you're also an egoist. If you're the right kind of altruist, you're also an egoist, but an ethical egoist. And so actually the two are very complementary, not and that said, like, egoist in terms of like doing what's in your self-interest, not egoist in terms of disregarding other people's interests, which is another, like, egoism is another topic that I am trying to get to write a paper on. I'd argue the world's ills are all based in ego-driven problems. Like, I think the root cause of all problems is the ego. But that said, that's another story for another day. and I haven't read the paper yet.
Yeah. There's ways that we can bring these things together, and I think
Yeah,
we need to bring them together for community education. Yeah.
agreed. And I think that concept of altruism being in people's self-interest is really important for community education, because if we can create a cohesive community of people who know that helping each other is in their own best interest, then you break down a lot of the barriers that prevent people from being altruists and create a more altruistic society, which I'd argue is a healthier society and one with more tighter social connections, which has been proven to, help people's happiness and longevity both. So, and that's really what the Freethinker Institute is intended to be, is a catalyst for creating meaningful relationships of people who help each other be the best version of ourselves. So all of this is kind of near and dear to me.
Yes. So Parsons, the sociologist, and I must admit, I haven't yet got my handle on, I've got a couple of Talcum Parsons books, but I mean, as I understand it, he's the one that really sort of is articulating this concept of social interaction, which, picks up what you're saying, Gareth, in terms of mutuality. So I think that's one area that we need to get read in and get under, get an understanding of, is how people interact in terms of society. But the other thing is too, in terms of the challenge around mutual awareness, mutual respect, mutualism, whatever you want to call it, is trust. And that's another theme in the literature, much broader than community education, of course, but is trust. I mean, this is a big issue in American politics at the moment, isn't it? It's trust. Perhaps it's a bit of an issue here around in Australia, but it's not as divisive. We've got an election coming up in May, and it's likely that we will continue this traditional pattern that after 2 or 3 terms of government, of the same government, we'll throw them out. And so we tend to seesaw between Labor and the coalition, which is Liberal and National parties. So, the consensus around the election at the moment is that we've just had a gut full of the current government, and that's how Australian politics traditionally works. It doesn't have that militancy, deep, I have to say, hatred that's sort of in the American political system, around this idea of conservative and liberal. I've said it to you before, Gareth. The rest of the Western democracies do not understand the American terminology of liberal and conservative, because it's basically for the West, for all the scholars and the general population in other Western democracies, it's bullshit talking, to label people like liberals or label people conservatives in this ridiculous way. That's not the literature of Western political thought. It's been totally skewed in American politics, and Richard Hofstadter and the other consensus historians articulated that in the 1960s, how that distortion was taking place.
Interesting. I think that's a good conversation for another night, because we're kind of winding up to 9 o'clock. But I will say politics in the US has also radically changed even in the last 10 to 15 years. When I was young, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans could all have a polite conversation about a topic and agree to disagree. But now it's like, as soon as you get into a political conversation, it's an all-out brawl, and it becomes like, death threats, and it's like ridiculous, the level of and that's exactly like why I think it's so important to have politeness be the one rule of the group, and for us to be able to talk about politics in the group in a very polite way, because without dialogue and without sharing ideas across political ideas, you end up with echo chambers, and people only reverberate their own ideas, which may not be grounded in reality. And it's only by like opening up the closet doors and letting in the sunshine do you see reality. And I think that through transparency we can find truth much more effectively. Transparency and listening with an open mind. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
So as you get closer to the end, we had a reality check about a month or two ago. I think Jay, you were in that meeting, and one of my I facilitated a club. Jay facilitates a club, and I tend to be a well-detailed. I've been accused of presenting master classes in our discussion groups. In fact, I take George Berlin compliment Jay to heart. When George Berlin then says, "Kevin, that is a master class," I take that as a compliment.
Yeah.
And I think you would, I think you would as well.
Oh yeah.
But the point I wanted to make was we were in the middle of a heated thread, and I'm pointing out facts and facts and facts and facts. And one of our lovely members, they're both in the late 80s. Ginny raised her hand and said, "Kevin, man, you double check, you fact check. I can't question any of your details, any of your resources, any of that. But you have to remember, Jim and I live with our perceptions, not the facts." and we said, "Well, there you have it.
Yep.
There you have it."
Right. Alternate reality. We invented it.
Garrett and Neville, wonderful to meet everybody, and everybody else. Wonderful group. Good to see you guys.
Same.
Good.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you all.
I hope it's been helpful.
Yeah.
I hope it's been helpful. Yeah. So I'm interested in any feedback in terms of what you thought was particularly helpful. If anything was.
Yeah, and we will also send a survey for feedback. Sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Too much to summarize. Sorry.
We'll send a survey as well. So we would love your feedback in the survey. If you get the chance.
Oh God, another survey.
Sorry. We're all about self-improvement, right? So continuous improvement is the name of the game. That includes getting feedback. So.
All right.
See everybody. Good
Thanks
night.
a lot, everyone.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Great
Thanks, Neville, for leading the conversation.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for
Bye-bye.
participating.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.